All right, so week 13. This week we are going to be talking about two important topics in applied international trade. One is the argument known as the pauper labor argument that basically says that um, you shouldn't open to international trade, to free trade with countries that have lower productivity and lower wages, because that will just cause um, firms to flee towards those countries. The second topic that we cover is going to be what I call the international labor mobility or immigration. So, what changes in the economy if we have an influx of immigrants that participate to the labor force into a country? So these are two very hot topics. The pauper labor argument has been used many times in the past presidential election and even currently to discuss whether it's a good idea for the US to be in NAFTA or not. We will see that our international trade theory says that all we need for having mutual benefits from trade is to have wages in line with productivity differences across countries, and we will offer some empirical validation for that. For the economics of immigration, we'll kind of explore a different variety of topics. First, we will take a look at how our production mix changes if we have an influx of immigrants. For that, we will use the instruments that we learned when we talked about trade based on factors, on factor abundance. So, an influx of immigrants is an influx of labor, sometimes an influx of specific labor. If the immigrants that come in are college graduates, it might be high skilled labor. If immigrants that come in don't have a college degree, it might be more low skilled labor. We'll see how that changes the composition of goods produced in the economy. And then we'll try to answer kind of the $1 million questions, which is what's the impact of immigration on wages? We will see that. First, we'll analyze the case offered by what economists call a quasi-natural experiment. The influx of Cuban immigrants in the 1980s that happened kind of unexpectedly and that flooded, in a sense, Miami's labor market. We will see that quite surprisingly, the wage of low-skilled workers in Miami did not fall, and we'll see that the reason for that might be adjustments in markets that are not necessarily just the labor markets, but other markets, like the capital market. Labor and capital are complements, and so if more labor comes into the economy, more capital will be demanded, and so that's going to mask or that's going to compensate a little bit the effect that the influx of immigrants might have on the wage. Then we'll move on and talk a little bit about the H1B debate, which you also have as a topic for your discussion this week. So we will see that we'll offer a very simple small open economy analysis of the H-1B visa case. So the H-1B visas are visas that are offered to foreigners for specialty occupations like software engineers, like doctors. So the government basically is putting a limited number of spots for these foreign workers in occupations where there's not a whole lot of supply of domestic workers. So we will see the economic consequences of that. Clearly, it must be the case that for firms to find it convenient to hire foreign workers, it must be that these workers are willing to supply labor at a lower wage than domestic workers. We will see that the visa, the quota imposed by this government program, so remember, H-1B visa is just like a limited number of seats that the government sets for this visa, is going to push upward the wage, the equilibrium wage in this market for specialty occupations. Finally, we will also see, though, that if the presence of these workers in specialty occupation in some way stimulates creating new ideas, stimulates innovation, then there might be a further effect on demand. this is very similar to what we have just seen in the previous slides for the case of the immigrants to the Miami labor market. When I have an influx of low-skilled immigrants, I'm going to have demand for something that I'm going to increase demand for something that complements low-skilled immigrants, like restaurants. For high-skilled workers in specialty occupation, I'm going to have increased demand for factors that are specific to these high-tech occupations. So maybe new startups in the software development sector, new startups in medical devices, and so on and so forth. But so if I have more demand for that, we will see that the impact of allowing immigrants in on the wage is not as obvious as we might think. I hope that you find this lecture interesting. It's kind of it's a new lecture. I already had in the past lectures on the economics of immigration. This year I decided to make things a little more interesting, combining this general idea of like what's the impact of globalization and open economies on the wage of domestic workers. And so we combine a little bit of what we've seen with trade from the basics of trade with something a little new about immigration. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to post in a discussion board or email me as usual. Okay. Have a good week.